Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon and evening, wherever you may be. My name is Justin Reich, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society. And I thank you for joining us to discuss this incredibly important and timely topic of why history matters. If you're not yet a member of the Society, I encourage you to join by going to winstonchurchill.org/join. Before I introduce my esteemed guests, I'd like to alert you of two housekeeping items. First, this discussion is being recorded and will be on our YouTube page in the coming days. Second, we will be taking questions from the audience later in our conversation, and you can submit your questions by using the Q&A function. I encourage you to do so because we will be rewarding two participants who submit the two best questions, as judged by me, with premium memberships in the International Churchill Society. Furthermore, even if your question is not read out to the panelists during our live conversation, it will still qualify to be considered for the free membership prize. Now allow me to introduce the guest speakers. First, we are joined by Trevor Phillips, who is a writer and television producer. He is the chairman of the Global Freedom of Expression campaign charity Index on Censorship, a senior fellow at the Policy Exchange think tank, and a vice president of the Royal Television Society. Thank you for your time this evening, Trevor.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
We're also joined by Mitchell Reese, who is a distinguished fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was the president and CEO of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and the president of Washington College. Before that, he served as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and as Special Envoy for the Northern Ireland peace process. Mitchell, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So to begin our discussion, I'd like to share two Churchill quotes, which I think stage our conversation and accurately describe the goals of this conversation. The first being the famous, "Study history, study history." The second quote is more nuanced. It was included in his eulogy of Neville Chamberlain. He said, quote, "History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this?" Question mark, end quote. So if I may first ask the question that's the name of this conversation, I'm going to pose it to you, Trevor. And the question is simple but profound. Why does history matter?
Well, thank you, Justin. I think it's an important place to start, because unless we know why we're having the conversation, we may well just be talking past each other, or throwing balls of candy floss at each other, frankly. I think the second quote is very interesting and very telling. You will know that I, not so long ago, quoted the English historian Roy Porter, who was probably, in this country anyway, in UK, the greatest historian of medical sciences. And what Porter says, and I'm quoting this from memory, I hadn't intended to say this again, but he said that the historical record is like the night sky. You look up and you see points of light, and we group them into mythic constellations. But for the most part, what we see is darkness. And actually, it's not that far away from your second quote, because I think the emphasis on history as illumination is extremely important. We don't just study history in order to have an interesting soap opera full of kings and queens and fascinating characters. We study history to really try to understand, to reverse engineer, I guess, that I'm a chemist, so I suppose I speak this language, to reverse engineer the path by which we got here. And those points of light, or the flickering moments that the candle reveal, are each and independently, they are only part of the picture. And in fact, they're generally speaking a tiny part of the picture. But what we do with each of those frames that the flame reveals, or the points of light as Porter would have, is that we try to use each of those moments to try to understand not just the top of history, but all of the currents that go on underneath. Essentially, we try to create a pattern out of those moments and incidents and personalities that we can see to try to understand the everyday. Why do we want to try to understand the everyday? Very simple. If we understand the path that we've been on, we will understand the parts of those paths that have been dangerous to humanity. We will understand the cul-de-sacs that we've gone into and that we should never want to go into again. And we will hopefully understand the most promising pathways that give human beings the opportunity to flourish. So that is why we study history, not simply because it's interesting to look at the past, or that we use them as cudgels with which to beat each other, but as a way to create a map into the unknown, which we call the future. And I would just say one other, perhaps slightly less, if you like, grandiose thing. I think the study of history in and of itself, and I would say this as a scientist, has a particular benefit in terms of intellectual discipline. The study of history conducted properly is in itself an education in process, in understanding how to find information, how to compile it, how to gain insight from it, how to understand what you do not know, and to establish the limits of your knowledge, and therefore the limits of what you think, what you can say with certainty. I think the if you like, history, the study of history helps us understand process. And lastly, as a character, a good study of history also helps people to be humble, because faced with the enormous body of information that one might try to make sense of, any sensible human is, if you like, humble about their own capacity to understand it.
That's an incredible last remark. And Mitchell, as someone, as a professional who worked without a historical organization, president of a college, what's your opinion on why history matters in your responses to Trevor?
Well, let me try and build on that very eloquent commentary by Trevor and the two quotes that you cited by Winston Churchill. And I think in short, it's the use of history helps us understand the past, and it helps us understand the present. So at its best, the study of history is really an exercise in empathy. So we try to understand why people lived the way they did, why they made the choices they did, under what constraints did they operate, what trade-offs did they have to make. It's really an exercise in imagination, in improving our understanding of the human condition. And then it's also, at its best, an exercise in providing perspective, as Trevor said, trying to mine lessons from the past that can shed light on present day life, both our personal life and issues of great moment for states in the international system. And so again, the idea is that there is very little that's unique or unprecedented in the world. There's this marvelous track record if we know where to look, how to look. And again, as Trevor absolutely appropriately said, with a great dose of humility, we're able to then extract some lessons from it they can help provide perspective and perhaps guidance as we go forward today.
And Mitchell, I want to ask you, throughout your career, especially with your important role in the Northern Ireland peace process, did Trevor's point about how history allows people to process, and that's how you understand, how did history come into your and your team's work in that process and in your career?
Well, you know, it's often been said that one of the problems with America is that we don't have enough history. And I would say one of the problems with Ireland is it probably has too much history. And of course, history is really plural. Everybody has stories, everybody has narratives. There's different historic moments that resonate more for one person or a group of people than others. And so the historical record was always present in the room whenever we were negotiating in Northern Ireland, because it did influence the character of the individuals, but also the politics of present day. And so you had to understand the past. You again had to have that empathy in order to understand where people were coming from. The challenge really was not letting it overwhelm you, not letting it hold you prisoner to what could be a better future. And so that really, it's, you sort of have to hold both of those at the same time to be able to really find a pathway forward for a peace process to work in Northern Ireland.
Trevor, as a scientist, and I ask this as the son of a scientist who whose great interest in history led me to where I am. Mitchell said history gives humans empathy. What other attributes, whether they be direct or indirect or peripheral, does history provide, studying humanities and history provide for someone who's in STEM like yourself, or for students who are currently studying those areas? And Trevor, you're on mute, I'm sorry to say.
Forgive me. That's a very interesting question. Can I just say, by the way, just quickly in passing on what Mitchell said about Northern Ireland, my family comes from a country which used to be known as British Guyana, is now Guyana, which has been plagued for the whole of my lifetime by ethnic conflict in rather similar, in some ways, to Northern Ireland. And actually, one of the things that we say is that people come along and they say, you guys you need to get to know each other across the boundaries of race and ethnicity and religion. And actually, the truth is, most of us would say that's part of our problem, that we actually know each other very well. And the more we know each other, the less we like it. But so history, I think, has to be properly interpreted and framed for it to be an assistance, rather than an albatross around the neck of societies. And in a way, that's part of the answer to your question about the other things that the study of history and the understanding of history, which are not necessarily the same thing, by the way, can bring to us. The thing that I think a lot of scientists will take from history is the idea of human fallibility. I mean, the whole point about most science, all genuine science, is that the scientific mentality is that I've got a theory today and it kind of works. I can build a bridge, or I can create a vaccine, or whatever. But actually, what I know is that it's the best theory that I have. But tomorrow, science means that somebody will get a better theory that has less approximation in it, that has more predictability, that has more efficacy. And one of the things that I think that great history and great science have in common is a really huge dollop of doubt about our own ability to understand the human condition and causations and so on. So I think people who are not historians when we read history, I think we benefit from being reminded that there are no certainties about the human condition. There are probabilities, and every now and again you have to make a choice based on, some of what you know, and you have to take risks. But I think one of the great things about the study of history is that it undermines the notion that is usually the province of authoritarians, that actually we can know it all and we can be certain. And once we've decided, everybody has to agree with us. So that's one of the good things I think about history.
Mitchell, I thought Trevor's point is a very initial point with this response of the lack of study of history and the lack of understanding of history are not the same. However, the study of history in colleges and universities, at least in the United States, is on the decline. Can it be argued that the lack of the study of history directly impacts a lack of understanding of history?
Well, unless you have people studying history, they don't even have a chance to understand it. So part of the challenge in the United States for the last couple of decades now is that less American history certainly is being taught in K through 12 grades. And there's lots of reasons for that. I think the primary one is teachers teaching to the test with the standards of learning. It also means that there are fewer students that are majoring in history at American colleges and universities. And so again, you don't have people being given the opportunity to even make that threshold recognition that history has so much to offer. And part of the challenge, which I think is structural right now in the academy, in the United States at least, is that large survey courses or introductory courses are really out of favor that might entice and attract students that have a curiosity in history, perhaps want to try it. The academy really privileges professors whose research is narrower and narrower. This is what it takes to get published in peer-reviewed journals. It's what it takes to get promoted, and it is what it takes to get tenured. And so the incentives are really running against a more popular outreach effort by the academy. And it also means that the academic professors are no longer writing for general audiences the way they used to do in the 50s and 60s. All of the popular historians in the United States today, and probably in England also, aren't academic appointments. They're people like David McCullough or Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meacham, John Keegan, Charles Moore, even Boris Johnson. None of these folks have academic appointments, certainly not full-time. And so they're filling a need that the academy used to fill. And that's all to the good. But again, I think that you're missing a generation of university students that really need to have a basic understanding of history for all the reasons that Trevor said: humility, the process of learning, being able to sift through information, and being able to make conclusions based on less than perfect information.
And understanding the difference, if I may say, between a secondary source and a primary source, which
for sure
I have been amazed to find happens quite a lot. So I would like to switch gears and move towards how technology has affected the conversation around history. Yeah, Trevor, please.
I wonder if I could just I really so agree with what Mitchell just said, and that as he was saying it, I thought to myself, actually, of course, there's a whole other group on the landscape now who are, if you like, the popular historians, like who write novels. Let's say Robert Harris, actually, who is a good who writes novels like Fatherland about the Nazis and so on, who are actually first rate in terms of their study and their accuracy and so on, but they write characters set in a historical setting. And that's it's a different kind of discipline. They're the biographers, Caro and people of that kind. And I would have said that there's a very interesting thing that I'd be interested to hear Mitchell and others' views about this. I think that what used to be history is now essentially fragmented into different areas, and some of them are good, what I would regard as good disciplines. Like there's a new thing called archaeogenetics, which is a mixture of archaeology and genetic DNA studies, which does use primary sources, but actually primary physical sources to understand the past. But then there are other areas like media studies, my own territory, Black studies, women's studies, which I don't want to, if you like, disrespect, but the history components in those areas are usually extremely bad history, which demand almost no discipline whatsoever, and privilege, if you like, invented narratives over, for example, first-rate, proper study of primary sources. And I think that's a very, very big change that seems to be coming out of the academy. When I look at this, when we look at people that we're hiring, they're clever people, but what they know is not the discipline of studying and understanding sources and using them in, if you like, the traditional way.
Mitchell, response, and if I can ask, from what I'm hearing from Trevor, are those disciplines an outgrowth of what you initially discussed on how the academy prioritizes narrower and narrower areas of study?
I think it is certainly a product of that trend, along with another trend, which is a beneficial one, which is more gender equality and having more female faculty members who have different interests, different focus. And I think that some of the scholarship is absolutely first rate, but I think where Trevor and I would agree is it really benefits from placing it in a broader context. So the idea is that you have to understand what really is happening in society at this time in order to measure accurately the contributions of women who are pathbreakers in their fields, or minorities who are really doing extraordinary things under unimaginable conditions. So you can't just focus on your own special narrow field. You have to place it in order to provide some meaning to it in this broader historical area. Where I thought Trevor was going to go when he started was actually in a slightly different direction, which is there's a whole new genre where people make up history.
Oh, yeah.
And so it used to be, there was sort of an academic component to it. And there was a wonderful book years ago called Cleopatra's Nose. And it was, if you could change one historical fact, how would history have changed? And the title of the book came from the one fact being, if Cleopatra had an unattractive nose and therefore was unattractive, Mark Antony never would have fallen in love with her, and the whole history of the Roman Empire would have been very different, okay? And then it's a little step from there where you have people that are really taking flights of fancy. So there's a trilogy that Newt Gingrich wrote about the South winning the Civil War, okay? Or you've heard if Kennedy was not assassinated. So again, those would kind of be amusing, I think, normally, but given the decline of history generally, I just think that it's a little dangerous because it could be the only history that anybody is ever going to know about. And we haven't really touched yet about the internet, where there's no filter and everybody can create their own history and their own narrative and make up whatever the heck they want.
The counterfactual point of view, you're right, is entertaining. I remember as a young boy, I read a book called What If ? And I learned about, incredible, like the Battle of Marathon and all of these things. So I learned about the history, but then of course it takes you down a path where it is now counterfactual. I really want to get into the internet. Trevor, like I told you initially before this webinar started, the genesis of this conversation came from watching your introduction of the Policy Exchange's recent conference also titled Why History Matters. So please excuse me, Policy Exchange, for lifting everything from your speaker and your title. But you said in your introduction, you said, quote, simply mining certain elements of history to create your own ideological argument just won't do, end quote. And you were referring to the internet, specifically social media. How damaging, and I could be wrong and challenge me if I am, but how damaging has the social media and internet been to the greater, broader, macro understanding of history that we've just been talking about?
In practice, I want to say it's been quite disastrous, but if I said that, that would be foolish, because it would imply two things. One is that somehow I thought it could be wound back, and I don't. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Genie's out of the bottle, got to deal with it. And secondly, it would be a misunderstanding of what is really in my head. I think the internet could be a huge boon in all sorts of ways. As a journalist, something that might have taken me a week to understand now generally might take me 20 minutes, because I can Google sources and so on. But I sort of, maybe I'm flattering myself, but because I was in a way schooled as a journalist in certain disciplines, I find it awkward to take the first answer that I find on the internet. So I will always look for a second or a third, and I will always go through to see if at least I can find, to get to the original, if I can. And then if I can't, I will also admit it in my text in some way. I'll say, this is what I understand, but I can't source it. I think the problem that we have is that many people now don't bother. You know, they find a fact that suits their narrative. One of the things I also, and I'm coming back again, I suppose, to where I think history and scientific method overlap. Generally speaking, if a scientist is confronted with evidence that doesn't fit his or her theory, what you instinctively, reflexively do as a scientist is you say, I've got to get me a new theory. That is, assuming you've tested the evidence and you know it works, it's real and so on, you go get yourself a new theory. I think what has happened with the internet is that people are now allowed to do the reverse. When they find some evidence that that conflicts with their narrative, they then go to Professor Google and find another kind of piece of evidence, even if it's complete nonsense, the source is unclear or anonymous, and they adduce it in order to support their narrative. As a consequence of it, which their narrative never changes. And that's okay, actually, if you're on the internet and you're always talking to people who share your narrative for political or ideological or ethnic reasons. It doesn't really matter in that case which evidence you select, as long as it supports the shared narrative. And I think that's where the disaster has occurred, that we have a situation in which the internet gets used to support preformed narratives. And to come back to a point that Mitchell made a moment ago, one of the reasons that I became very, very interested in this is that I think it is, generally speaking, to the disadvantage, particularly of cultural and ethnic minorities, because what tends to happen is that the place of minority groups in any historical record is either absent, or it's buried under the majority, or alternatively, what is now beginning to happen is that people select the facts that they want to, for example, glorify the past of that particular group in a particular way, and to take it completely out of the context that Mitchell talked about. If you want to understand the history of African Americans, you cannot abstract that from the history of America in general. So, for example, just a very simple example, the view that is taken about American slavery And, we don't need to argue about the horrors of slavery and how terrible it was and so on. But I've recently been having an argument with people about the nature of it. The truth is that if you look at the original sources, there were relatively few plantations in the American South which were large, that had hundreds or 1,000 slaves. That was characteristic of the Caribbean. In the United States, by and large, because plantation or farms were cotton and tobacco to begin with, and not sugar, they tended to be rather small and family owned. And actually quite often the owner would work alongside slaves. Now that creates a completely different history. It doesn't make the history any more palatable, any more acceptable, but Virginia is different to Jamaica. And if we don't understand those two, that difference, we're not really giving ourselves a proper account of slavery. And I think I worry about that, because what is now happening is there's a sort of broad wash that understands this background, mixes up Jamaica and Barbados and Virginia and Maryland as though they're all the same place. And that means that the history from which I come is actually now obscured. It hasn't been illuminated, it's become obscured.
Mitchell, response, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Trevor said earlier on, which is sort of the pernicious effect of the internet, and what really I think what he was talking about was confirmation bias, which is we always look for things that reaffirm or confirm our pre-existing notions, and I think that's part of the human condition for sure. The problem with the question is that it seems that it's very easy for us to see the negative consequences of the internet. We can see them on January 6th at the Capitol, or we see them with the QAnon followers. We see them with the fellow who thought that there was a pedophile ring run by the Democrats in a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. Those make news. That's clear, present, and dangerous. What we don't see, and I think we have to appreciate more fully, is the unprecedented availability of information right now and the accessibility of it to people that never in a million years would have had access to it. You can really go back to one moment, which was the moment when the Encyclopedia Britannica decided to put its contents online and the internet crashed. Okay, never had more information been disseminated at one moment in human history. And people were so eager to get it that the website crashed. And so again, now there's just a Niagara Falls of information, which has its dangers, as Trevor's identified. But I think that you have to, if you're gonna balance this up, I think that you have to put in the plus column the fact that people all over the world now have access to information that would be unimaginable only a few short years ago.
Yeah. That's such a, I could not agree more with that more. Just very briefly, I grew up in a small country where there were hardly any libraries. There was a Carnegie Library in Georgetown, and there was the US Embassy Library down the street. And if I wanted to know anything, I had literally, those were the two places where I could get books and see stuff. That, the kids there now, the country is no richer, though it's recently got oil, so it will become richer, but the country is no richer at the moment than it was when I was a kid. But my equivalent can now have the whole world at their fingertips. And I think Mitchell's point is very profoundly important.
I would like to move to a discussion on the namesake of this organization. I know you both are not Churchill scholars by any means, but I would really appreciate your points of view. We've gotten we've received some great questions. So please continue to ask them. And I know we only have about 25 minutes left, so I'll get right into them after this short discussion. But in 2020, the discussion around Winston Churchill's legacy changed, and changed dramatically. Trevor, you live in the UK. You saw that his statue was defaced. here in the United States, though he has a different legacy here than in the United Kingdom. The question I have is why has it become so difficult to have a discussion around someone who's been dead for 50 years and their legacy? And what happened to the context and nuance of looking at somebody who was born in the Victorian era and looking at them from today? I open up the floor to whoever would like to approach that first.
Well, let me take a shot at it. So the first thing that you can do in order to really appreciate and perpetuate the unprecedented contribution of Winston Churchill is to join the International Churchill Society, right, Justin?
I didn't pay him to say it.
But again, it's all part of the world that we live in now. You have to be able to do two things. You have to be able to read widely, not just things that confirm what you already believe, and you have to be able to think critically. And so you have to act as the filter now. When I was growing up, there were 3 television channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. And you'd sit around the dinner table and you'd watch the news every evening, and they were pretty much the same. And those folks were trusted, and everybody in the country got their news from one of those 3 sources. Today, it's completely different. And so it's more of a responsibility of citizenship, actually, to be able to read widely and to think critically. And that's really the best way to promote Churchill's legacy. There's always going to be critics. The fact that he's still being criticized speaks to his enduring relevance, I would also argue. But again, I think that we're in a moment right now. There's an expression that a pendulum never stops in the middle. So we've now seen perhaps an extraordinary amount of criticism of Winston Churchill defacing his statue outside Westminster. That's not going to last. But again, I think it's up to us to assume that obligation of citizenship to make sure that we understand just what this man did for all of us.
Yeah. For viewers in the United States, perhaps I should just issue a small corrective here. Not that anything Justin said or Mitchell says is wrong, but one of the things that I think isn't reported as wisely as it should be, and certainly not reported here in the UK, never mind anywhere else, is that Winston Churchill is still immensely popular in this country. I mean, he is still thought of. I think pretty much every poll will say that he is the greatest prime minister we've had. As it happens, I don't agree with that, but the plurality of British people think that that is the case, and they revere him. They're not stupid about his faults, by the way. The people with whom he is most popular are older people who completely remember the shambles of the Dardanelles, and many of whom will have had parents who went through the general strike, and in which Churchill did not play a particularly noble role, and so on. But he is still numero uno. And by the way, when we think about Churchill being a racist, it is worth saying that the name Winston is still, to this day, one of the most popular names in the Caribbean. I think it is, though, the 5th most popular name for a man in Jamaica. And that is not an accident. So I think we should, for colleagues who are not here, and indeed some who are in the UK, we should get the noise in perspective. Having said that, there is a battle here, and I'm a little bit, I see it a little bit more darkly, I think, than Mitchell does. I think there is a battle here, and it goes back to what I said right at the very beginning. If you can capture the past, if you can define the narrative of the past, then you can define the boundaries around the possibilities for the future of a society. And in this specific case, what the battle about Churchill represents is the battle to define Britain's past as irredeemably colonialist, racist, and essentially wicked in almost every possible way. If you can manage to define that, then what you essentially have is a society which can only be redeemed by essentially crashing it completely, tearing apart all its traditions, throwing out.
Oh, I think we may have lost Trevor, but when he returns, we'll certainly allow him to continue that thought. Mitchell, before he gets back, there's a great question that came in, which I will pose to you. Historian E.H. Carr once said, "Study the historian before you begin to study the facts." Does the panel agree with this?
Well,
Can I just quickly say this?
Yeah, Trevor, he's back. Yeah, please continue.
The way this works in practice is, for example, somebody who defends Churchill in this narrative must be a racist. So let's get them out of the university. Let's sack them from our newspaper. So that's what this is all about. It's much darker than just an academic argument.
May I ask Trevor, with that point of view, and on that argument of tagging someone, if you will, with a pejorative identity, and then canceling them, which I think is very okay for us to discuss because that is what's been going on across the world. What is the damage of that attitude?
Well, if we're thinking about the academy, there are several different damages. I mean, just generally speaking, as a matter of freedom of expression, as a matter of principle, it is wrong. You know, number two, any society in which we don't have the muscles in which to combat evil intellectually and verbally is on its way to its own destruction. I mean, if the only way that if we cannot defend principles and equality and values by persuading our fellow citizens, then I think we're lost. And then I think there is, but what I think is really, just in practice at a sort of rather banal level, what we are seeing at the moment and what is really at stake here is a self-confidence of the opinion makers and performers and educators, universities, media, and those who are in charge of cultural and museums, cultural organizations, museums and galleries. If they do not have the confidence to have contestation about the past within their institutions, and essentially anybody who departs from the orthodoxy is cancelled, and any idea which challenges the orthodoxy is suppressed, then I think, we are on the verge of collapse of, I'm not going to go into collapse of civilization, but we will become very, very different societies, and societies that are the societies have two things. One is less innovation, and ultimately, I would argue, societies which become majoritarian and oppressive to minority point of view. And you can understand, looking at me, why I fear that more than anything else.
Certainly. Mitchell, any responses?
No, I was very interested in hearing what Trevor said and putting it in the context of the UK and the current debate. I would only add that the university was created centuries ago with special privileges. And the whole system of tenure was based around keeping professors, dons, members of the faculty away from the anger of the king and the church. Therefore, they had the privilege to say anything they wanted.
Yeah.
And they had tenure so that they could do it without fear of harming their career or worse. And so, again, tolerance for free speech is sort of woven into the very fabric of the whole university system from the very beginning. And I share Trevor's concern. I don't think it's quite at that stage yet in the United States, but certainly there are indications along the same lines.
Well,
We have a case here where a teacher, there's not a university problem, but a teacher has just gone into hiding, and he will never work again in a school because he conducted a lesson in which he showed the Charlie Hebdo cartoon to a class. He has now been hounded out of his school in a country which has no law against blasphemy.
That's incredible. Wow. So to get into these questions, I know we only have about 10 minutes left. Again, thank you to all of our participants who have submitted them. So Trevor, you may have heard me ask this question. I'd like Mitchell if he could answer it. The question was, historian E.H. Carr once said, study the historian before you begin to study the facts. Do you agree with this comment? Mitchell, and then Trevor, please.
I have a feeling that there was probably an academic vendetta at the heart of that. I don't think most people have the time or the inclination to study the historian. I think you can get a pretty good idea of where an historian is coming from, his or her perspective. So, that may have been relevant back then. I'm not quite sure I understand the whole context of E.H. Carr's comment.
Yeah, I'm going with Mitchell here, and I would slightly worry about that. We have an expression here, which is that you shouldn't play the man, you play the ball. And I just worry about somebody who says, let's not worry about what the guy says. Let's look at his history and dig up stuff he said, and then we'll interpret whatever he said through that lens.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the product reveals the person. I mean, thinking of a historian such as, David Irving. I mean, everyone knows when you hear
Indeed.
David Irving, you know exactly what he is interested in. And so certainly the product reveals the person's. A great question asks, would the panelists agree that history is dynamic, interpretations changing through the ages, and filtered by the society interpreting it in order to make sense of current circumstances? For example, what caused the Civil War, American Civil War, ? The answers would be different today, 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
I think that's absolutely right. Each generation interprets and reinterprets its own history. The challenge, of course, is not to have it escape the academic rigor that's necessary for good history so that it becomes overly politicized and is used as a partisan weapon. And we've seen that recently in the United States with the New York Times 1619 project, and then the attempt to counter it by the Trump administration with the 1776 project. So again, both of those are worth reading on their own, but that shouldn't be the final word on these things, but they do reflect, I think, contemporary American political divisions.
I think the statement is right-ish, but I wonder if actually what changes is not history or the historical record. We may add to it, and that might change our understanding. But I think what probably changes is consensus. And that's a different thing from history. And I have no objection to consensus, by the way. I think part of scholarship is a struggle to find what is the most likely thing to be, the reality or the nearest to truth. In the case of history, what took place. But I would be nervous about saying what I think some people believe, that actually, history is basically all relative, and it's always interpreted through the needs of the particular society. I think that is probably true of poor history, but I don't think it is necessarily always true of proper history. I think the consensus is influenced by the current needs, what you need to explain today. What you need to explain in a recession is probably different than what you need to explain when we are in boom times. But it doesn't mean that the record has changed. What it means is that the priorities and the consensus have changed.
Yeah, Trevor, thank you. That's a really good point. I'll just give an example from my own experience. during the Second World War, the programming at Colonial Williamsburg emphasized much more the revolutionary martial valor of the founding fathers and the fighting spirit. After the end of that war, during the Cold War, there was a shift to promoting the values of the founding father because we were in this conflict over values with the Soviet Union. And so again, it was a subtle shift, but it was absolutely very clear. And I think it really proves Trevor's point.
Mitchell, question for you. This came from the chat. Was Churchill such a great leader due to his keen sense of history, or because he learned from his own earlier mistakes, which as Trevor pointed out, not just the Dardanelles, but think of Narvik in Norway, his not very ill-advised siege there. So yeah, how do you think, why was it a leader because of his sense of history, because he learned from his mistakes?
Well, I think we'd like to believe that he was a great leader because he was half American. But I think it's a false choice, right? It's neither one nor the other. It's a combination of many qualities. It's the man meeting the moment. It's him having the political and moral courage to speak up. You know, it's not for nothing that he placed courage as first among all the virtues, because without courage, you don't have any other virtues. So, you know, I don't think you can reduce his leadership ability, his particular genius, to one or two ingredients. I think he was the product of the Victorian age. He was the product of all of his experience: journalism, military, in government, and in opposition. And so again, history is complicated. It's messy, and you know that's one of the lessons you learn when you read it. People are complicated, and you know, Churchill certainly was all that.
Trevor, your thoughts?
I agree with what Mitchell said. I wouldn't have anything to add.
So my last question for you two gentlemen today, and again, thank you for your time and thank you for all of those who tuned in. I want to get back to Trevor's comment of this teacher who can't work in a school again. How does society overcome that consequence, which, although maybe is not borne out in fact, but seems to be a foregone conclusion? And you said the country that he's in doesn't have any laws against blasphemy. So is it a legal solution for that could protect someone like him or her or whoever else down the road? How do you rectify this?
Well, in my time in public office, which was way too long, I employed a lot of lawyers. And one of the things I learned was that lawyers love this kind of situation because they think the law is a combat weapon, and that's what they enjoy doing. But what I also learned was that though you need to use the law sometimes to protect people, and occasionally you can use it to create an environment that will tend towards social justice or environmental justice or whatever, by and large, it does not deliver a better society or a better culture. So I would never really start with the law. What I think is true here is that this is a cultural and a political issue in which, bluntly speaking, in our country, the Mandarin caste, and Americans will understand, I think, what I mean by that, has essentially lost its nerve. It doesn't really quite know what it believes in. And by the way, this is partly, in my view, a failure of historical perspective. It thinks, people think that they've invented everything. Nothing really happened before, I don't know, Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, but that actually we came up with all of the ideas about what is good and what's not good and so on. So I think that there is a problem about trying to apply the law to solve a political and cultural issue. And the political and cultural issue that is actually at the center here is whether it is the case that we as a society, as a liberal democratic society, should forbid the utterance of words that make some people and some groups of people feel bad or even intimidated. The reason I am the chair of Index on Censorship, which is Global Freedom of Expression charity, is that we've been here before. 70 years of Soviet life. Index was started to publish the works of Solzhenitsyn and others who were behind the Iron Curtain, who had been banished to the gulags. The Soviets tried for 70 years to suppress the words of a whole, of all sorts of people, under the assumption that if you could suppress the word, you would drive the thoughts out of people's heads. And that society, the things that those bad people thought, would essentially vanish from that society. Well, of course, we now know that's not plausible. There's Mitchell will probably know more about this than I do. The whole idea of the perfectibility of the human being, which rules the notion that actually if you stop people thinking things, you'll stop them saying them, and then the lovely society that we will have will be characterized by peace and harmony and people not saying horrible things to each other and not doing horrible things to each other. Well, this is just nonsense. And I think that the point about this particular issue is that you will never solve these things because they're part of human nature. They are part of an eternal struggle. And my view is that, from my point of view, you have to fight every fight as it comes along, try and persuade people. And though, there's a tendency now here amongst them liberal, and by the way, I'm a liberal lefty myself, there's a tendency amongst the liberal classes to say, oh, why are you getting so worked up about this? It's not such a big deal. It's one guy and so on. Well, the truth of the matter is one guy loses his job and 1,000 guys then say, you know what, we won't deal with this. We won't teach about this blasphemy thing because it's just too difficult. And then that means 1 million school children never understand why we allow religious freedom. There'll be 1 million school children who will never really, for example, understand why America became America. Because actually America is above anything else about people who wanted to live their lives and worship in the way that they wanted to worship. And if you cannot understand that, you cannot understand why this was a problem in the past, how would you ever understand the United States? And by the way, how would you ever understand why we don't want to be Iran or Saudi Arabia?
Mitchell, any last thoughts?
Yeah, well, those were very powerful comments. I just want to add that I agree with Trevor that the law has to be the underpinning of any civilized society, but cultural issues are going to loom much larger. And as Trevor said, it's a fight that you have to fight every day. You can visit Oxford and there's a memorial to the martyrs who were burned at the stake for having different religious opinions. The whole Me Too movement recently in the United States has been women speaking out when they've been silent so long because of the consequences of speaking about men who had power over them and used it in horrific ways. So again, you have to be sensitive to this.
Excuse me, Mitchell, can I just say, what a great example. If you look at the way that the women who first spoke out were treated by the media and the powerful, exactly what you're saying. Brilliant example.
So you have to be tolerant, you have to be supportive, you have to be open to this. It's never going to be perfect. Political courage, profiles in courage, they're honored because they're not as frequent as we would like. And
Yeah.
so I think that we have to recognize that whenever we see it, and just try to keep an open mind about things. But Trevor's living that every day, so I applaud him in his efforts.
Well, gentlemen, I greatly enjoyed this conversation. Incredibly timely, important, like I said at the beginning, eye-opening in many ways. And I just, as a moderator, agree with you. Tolerant society should not ever um, um, go away and should not be a secondary. So thank you. And for the participants, I want to let you know, I will be reaching out to you for those who submitted a question to see if you received the prize of joining as a member of the society. And again, I wish you both well. Thank you for your time. And this recording will be on our YouTube page in the coming days. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you. Great to see you, Mitchell. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.